More than ever, according to public opinion polls, Americans want out of Iraq. The war has dragged on longer than most Americans imagined, and the White House and Pentagon are fighting an uphill political battle to bolster support for the war. How does a nation at war come to decide that the battle is no longer worth fighting? Would pulling out of Iraq mean the U.S. has lost? Lost what? Iraq or a broader war on terror? What about the Iraqis? Where would a U.S. withdrawal leave them? Do Iraqis want the U.S. to stay? What does the U.S. owe them? We'll raise these and other questions next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.
The war in Iraq is taking its toll in lives and treasure. It's expensive and deadly. More than 3,800 coalition forces have been killed, and somewhere between 66 and 100,000 Iraqi civilians, maybe more, have also perished. And the White House struggles to persuade Americans that things are getting better in the face of daily news of bombs killing soldiers or obliterating a crowded market.
Nothing's inevitable in Iraq except more bloodshed right now.
All the while, the fledgling Iraqi government, slowly reconstituting its security forces, seems unable or unwilling to help U.S. troops quell the violence.
They're trying to hold this thing together. They're sitting on a violent civil war. 27 million people struggling for political power and survival.
All that has left many Americans feeling they've had enough. Recent polls report that 66% of the American people feel the U.S. should either decrease the number of troops in Iraq or pull out altogether. And the war is losing support in Congress, too. Some once stalwart supporters of the president's Iraq policy from within his own party have come out in favor of getting out sooner than later. Amid a new presidential election campaign, the Democratic candidates have all called for either phased redeployments or immediate withdrawal.
If you are a Democrat, you can blame the Republicans. If you're a Republican, you can blame the Democrats. And each can make a pretty good case. But the fact of the matter is the country is not unified.
While the debate over staying or leaving gets attention in the media and around dinner tables, we hear much less about the consequences of either course of action. If tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians are dying every year now, what will happen if coalition forces leave? Might it get even bloodier? Would a U.S. departure create a power vacuum? And if so, who will step in to fill it? Other Arabs? The Iranians? Would they be able to accomplish what the U.S. hasn't? There are so many different factions in Iraq about which Americans know very little. Sunnis, Shiites, Kurds, and even within these groups there are different sects and tribes. Among fighting forces, there's al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Iraqi security forces themselves, and militias controlled by various political and religious factions. Will they be able to resolve their differences? Do Iraqis even want to resolve them? Exiting Iraq, deadline for democracy. Next on Great Decisions.
And now from our New York studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Joining us to discuss the future of Iraq, both for Iraqis and for the United States, are Colonel Michael Meese, a political science and economics professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point, and a top advisor to current U.S. Commander in Iraq, General David Petraeus. And Les Gelb, Chairman Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and a former Pentagon and State Department official and Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter. Welcome to you both. Colonel Meese, just as a matter of record here, you're in uniform here, and of course you're operating properly and naturally under chain of command rules as a member of the military. Does that mean you can't say anything that isn't the policy of the Commander-in-Chief or your direct commander, General Petraeus?
No, thank you for asking, Ralph. It's great to be here. And I'm here in my capacity as a professor at West Point, although I spent the last 3 months working in Baghdad with General Petraeus. The comments that I'll make are those of my own only, and not those of General Petraeus or the Army or any other organization.
Okay. Gentlemen, let's just be clear for our audience as we're recording this. Things change quickly in Iraq, and we're not sure, obviously, what the future will bring. We're speaking about the war in Iraq, not Afghanistan, or what the president calls the war on terror. And at the moment, as we're recording this, there is no official policy about withdrawal or exit strategy or anything of that sort. The president and General Petraeus have made that clear. But we're kind of brainstorming about what's on the minds of a lot of American citizens, which is what happens in the future in Iraq. With that in mind, Les Gelb, do you want to offer a prescription for the president or for the U.S. military or for the Iraqi government?
I'll offer the prescription that I think everybody who studies insurgencies believes in, that you can't have a military victory to this war. You can only have a political victory. And for that, we need a political settlement among the major Iraqi factions. And that has got to be the key to American strategy. If we do that right, it'll turn out all right. If we don't, no matter how good our military performs, we won't win.
Colonel Meese?
I would agree with that a security solution is not going to be the thing that will solve the issues in Iraq. It has to be a political settlement, and that political settlement has to be done by Iraqis. It's very difficult to impose that from outside of Iraq by either an international body or some kind of super organization to be able to do that. The Iraqis have showed very slow steps forward in terms of resolving issues of federalism, revenue sharing, oil distribution, issues like debathification that are very complex to solve, but they're the ones that have got to solve these issues, and I think to the extent that we can, diplomatically, economically, and politically, we should help them do that.
You know, we hear a lot about the Iraqis have to do this, the Iraqis have to do that, the military has to stand up, the police have to stand up, and so on and so forth. What incentive is there for any of the Iraqi factions at this point to help ease the pain of the United States, which began the war in 2003?
For continuing the insurgency, their incentive is hatred and mistrust. Those are very powerful. And I guess all we can offer them on the other side is their common self-interest. It is the principle of federalism, allowing the major ethnic groups basically to run their own affairs with a limited but consequential central government in Baghdad. If you want that, that's available to you. If you're going to keep on killing each other and not make a political deal, what you'll do is drive this country apart and drive American support completely out of this war.
And I think you've seen in some small cases that taking place where Iraqis have seen the alternative and then have chosen that. Let me give two examples. One that was widely noted last year was the change in Anbar, where Anbar citizens turned against al-Qaeda that had been supporting them when the Sunnis thought that they were going to be completely isolated from the government. They turned to al-Qaeda and partnered with them. And last year they turned against them, fought against them, and now Anbar, through late last year, was one of the most relatively peaceful, attacks diminishing, and a return to a sense of normalcy. And the Sunni Arabs that were in that Euphrates River Valley saw that that's what they wanted to go for. The same thing is true in even more problematic areas, such as the Abu Ghraib suburb of Baghdad, where the Shia government made accommodations with about 1,700 former insurgents and allowed them to be part of a local security force. So this, whether it's federalism or it is local control in specific areas, Iraqis can choose normalcy and see that that's an appropriate way forward as opposed to killing each other.
You know, I think we've been speaking about kind of a national interest in Iraq, and there are some people, I think many people actually, who don't necessarily think Iraqi political leaders see a national interest. They're looking at a narrower interest, an interest associated with their religious faction or their geographic location or an economic interest or whatever. Congressman Lee Hamilton, former congressman from Indiana, who's the president of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, told Great Decisions that he sees the leadership in Iraq as being more factional than national. Let's listen.
The real question that lingers in my mind in talking with Iraqi leaders is, are they Iraqi leaders or are they sectarian leaders? And I must say the evidence has been pretty strong that they are sectarian and not Iraqi leaders. The question, I guess, at this point is whether they're capable of being Iraqi leaders, of bringing the country together, whether they have the political will to do it, or whether they're jockeying for sectarian position within the country.
What's your judgment about that?
Well, there's no question that they're jockeying for their own sectarian positions. That's why we don't have national reconciliation. That's why we haven't had it for 4 years. These other things that are pulling them apart, their history, makes it impossible for them to make these deals right now. Now, let me come back to something Colonel Meese brought up earlier. That is, we shouldn't bash their heads to get this political agreement. Well, of course not. We can't impose it on them. It won't work. But we do have leverage on them, and we should use that leverage. Right now, one of my problems is the things going on in Anbar and Baghdad, they're good, and I approve of them. We should have been doing them before.
Agreed.
But you can't view them just as isolated acts. Otherwise, all you're doing is building up groups militarily that could come to make the Civil War worse. You've got to encase this opportunity in a political strategy. And that involves the United States doing a little arm twisting and cajoling to get them to move toward this political agreement.
And I think that we are. I think Representative Hamilton was exactly right. There are no national leaders. There is no Nelson Mandela that is going to be the broad Iraqi leader. Anybody who was of that kind of broad national outlook would have been killed under the Saddam regime. So you have sectarian leaders that are learning to be somewhat national, and I think that we have seen some efforts. For example, when Prime Minister Maliki traveled to Anbar, he actually went out to Ramadi, and like a political leader, a Shia political leader, he came bearing additional gifts, i.e. budgetary allocation for Anbar. And what he found was, like many other political leaders do, when you bring money to outlying states, the Sunni Arabs there applauded him and thought that was great. And so slowly the government is learning how to be political, slowly learning how to do what we would call here pork barrel spending.
And our problem is, as they're doing it slowly, and they are, and we can understand why.
Right.
It's not crazy that they're doing it slowly, but the clock is running out back here.
What clock is running out?
The political clock is running out back here, in essence, with Americans feeling we've been in this for over 4 years, paid a very high price, and we're doing it for the Iraqis. They should be able to put up a political deal to make it possible for us to leave in peace and to take care of our national security interests. And if they don't, more and more Americans begin peeling off and saying, let's get out. And that's not the answer. The answer is a political strategy and a withdrawal schedule or target or plan to back up that political strategy.
And you have to do something to move that Baghdad clock faster, as well as to, in some ways, slow down the Washington clock.
Right.
Because although the government in Baghdad is not as effective as it should be, it is not a failed state yet. If you pull out all of the security stops precipitously, not based upon conditions, and I would take issue with specifying a specific timeline, then you may end up.
I wouldn't have a rigid timeline. I would have a withdrawal plan to fit the political strategy.
Because it's
to put some pressure on the Iraqis to make these deals.
I would agree with that, because what you don't want, the worst solution would be a failed state in Iraq that has the government collapsing and leads to all kinds of problems.
Both of you have touched on something in this last discussion that I think is interesting, which is that the U.S. military is operating in Iraq, and the U.S. military is in a position of, you used the word cajoling, I think, to try to get the Iraqi leaders to do the things the United States wants them to do. Let's face it, though, the people who signed up to be in the Army or the Marines or whatever didn't sign up saying, I want to go abroad to build a constitution, to shape laws and put up electric power lines and that sort of thing. They went to fight. They signed up to fight a war. General Barry McCaffrey makes this point about the fact that the U.S. military is being asked in Iraq to do a lot of things which many military folks were not trained to do initially and which Donald Rumsfeld famously denounced at the beginning of this war. Let's hear what he has to say.
The military as a tool to wreck somebody else's military force is pretty decent. And they can indeed conduct counterinsurgency operations. But what we've ended up is, our infantry company commanders using the so-called SERP funds, Commanders Emergency Reconstruction Program funds, they're the ones out rebuilding electrical grids and sewer systems and trying to stand up city councils. They're actually doing pretty good. Our lieutenant colonel battalion commanders have graduate degrees, and they're reasonable people, and they're not afraid of losing their life driving around doing these things. But where's the rest of the government? The only people that are at war in Iraq is the U.S. Armed Forces and the CIA. And the rest of the government tends to sit it out. That's not to deny the courage of some foreign service officers.
That is a problem, has been a problem since the beginning. It isn't that that kind of assistance wasn't offered. The rest of the U.S. government did kick in at the beginning, but essentially was told, lay off. It's a military problem. Is that a challenge for the military now, the U.S. military in Iraq?
It is somewhat, and I would clarify, I think the military signed up to do whatever the appropriate authorities say that the military should do. And if that means reconstruction, counterinsurgency, the kinds of things that General McCaffrey described that we're doing very well over there, that's what folks will do. Standing up city councils, whatever will advance the U.S. national security policy in that area as determined by the leadership of the United States. The State Department has been helpful now with standing up enhanced provincial reconstruction teams that started this year. That probably should have started a long time ago, and we could have had far more of a diplomatic surge much earlier. But now that they are there, by the end of 2007, there's over 300 State Department people that are out there living with the brigade commanders and ensuring that the expenditure of these SERP funds and other funding is done in the most effective way. Not just having people like the U.S. military for doing things, but sustainable ways so that the Iraqis take credit for it and the Iraqis can push this forward to facilitate what Mr. Gelb said was a political agreement.
Les, do you want to comment on that question of whether the U.S. Has kicked in enough in terms of support for the kinds of civil nation-building types of activities?
This is an essential part of dealing with any security situation. And our military knew that in the wake of Vietnam and then got away from it. And the civilian leadership didn't help by saying, we're not going to do this stuff anymore. No more nation building, you don't have to worry about it. So when the situation arose, you could have predicted with certainty that the military was going to be asked to do all these things again. And now it's learning how to do them, and it's doing them pretty well. But it's late in the game because of that clock ticking in the United States on withdrawal.
Well, I want to follow up on that because the clock ticking is kind of an artificial clock.
It's called democracy, that artificial clock.
Absolutely, and they don't have it in Iraq.
Right.
Is there any reason to expect that Iraqis should understand that or be particularly concerned about the American political clock and the election year?
They understand it, Ralph. And that's why it's hard for me to find an Iraqi leader that wants to vote for a Democrat. They understand that the Republicans are much more likely to keep the troops in there longer. And that's what they want. They want the troops in there longer. They realized that our presence keeps that whole thing together. And that if we left, they'd be in deep trouble. So they're worried about the Democratic Party view gaining hold here. But they have to realize by what they're told by this administration, that clock is ticking, that it's a serious clock, that it's not just Democrats, that it's Americans generally saying, hey, get your act together or we're going to leave.
Well, and I would agree with you. The Iraqis do understand that the clock is ticking back in Washington. They've had the benefit of 31 senators visiting Iraq from just February to August of last year, over 25% of the House, and most of them all met with Iraqi leaders, and they made that point to them, which is one of the reasons why they have made some very slight progress on some of the political accommodations. I mentioned the ones in Anbar, in Abu Ghraib, and other areas, and more will be made. 7 provinces by August of 2007 have been turned over to Iraqi control. By the end of 2007, it should be a total of about 14 provinces that are turned over to Iraqi control, where there's almost no U.S. forces, and the announced withdrawal of a timeline of from 20 brigade combat teams to 15 brigade combat teams through 2008 does provide the incentive for Iraqis to take increasing control of more of their provinces.
We've been talking about political clocks. I think that's just another way of talking about public opinion in the United States, because it affects elections in the United States. Do either of you feel that somehow the war in Iraq ought to be above domestic U.S. politics, or somehow pulled out of that arena, that it should be bipartisan or nonpartisan or separate from public opinion pressures?
Look, I've spent my life dealing with these problems, and the kind of debates we have in wartime, whether it's Vietnam or Iraq, really infuriate me, because everybody knows what the stakes are. Whatever they say, they understand we have got serious national security interests involved in Iraq and in the Gulf. They know that.
And the military is going to serve whoever it happens to be in office, regardless.
Yeah, they'll do it. But the Democrats and Republicans reduce this debate to kind of fierce, irresponsible trivia, where the debate becomes, on the Democratic side, essentially, let's get out as quickly as possible, and the debate on the Republican side is just stay the course. And if you talk to a lot of these people in private, they'll say much more sensible things. They'll say they understand we need to start meshing a political strategy of pushing the Iraqis, toward a political deal with a withdrawal process, but they won't come together to say this. And it really
because it's an election year.
But it's also our national security. And at a certain point, that's got to mean more. And quite frankly, although they'll never test this proposition, I believe that if they acted in the way I'm talking about, the way they should be acting, that people would vote for them. They would say, these guys are sensible. I want them in office.
Well, and that's exactly what a series like this is. Anybody that's watching the Great Decision series sees that it's a much more nuanced debate than the sound bites that you hear from political candidates on the stump. And that understanding that is, I think, to the credit of the American people, and is a sad commentary on some of the political leaders.
Let's talk outside Iraq for just a moment. We're getting to the end of our program here. There are other people watching the clock as well. Iran is watching the clock. Saudi Arabia is watching the clock. Maybe Russia is watching the clock, and others, certainly in the Arab and Muslim world, are paying attention to the way this unfolds. General Wesley Clark, former NATO commander, spoke to Great Decisions. We asked him about what he sees in the strategic region there with regard to the end game in Iraq.
There are rumors in the region that other countries from outside have provided funds to the Sunnis to encourage them to side with the Americans. And so we may be seeing the beginnings of a new kind of Iron Curtain moving across parts of Iraq as the Sunnis organize themselves to face the Shia power.
So let me ask you this, in the broad scheme of things in the region, are the Iranians rooting for the Americans to get out or to stay in? You said the Iraqis want the Americans to stay in. Are the Saudis and other Arabs in the region looking for the United States to stay in, or they want the United States to get out?
Look, the new threat, the new boogeyman in the region is Iran. And another one of my fetishes is I can't stand how Americans give away power to other countries. We're talking about Iran as the wave of the future in the Gulf and the Middle East. Iran is nothing compared to the United States. Its economy equals Connecticut's. Its military capability is like a pinky compared to the United States.
But they can make trouble for the U.S. in the region.
Iranian power in the region comes from American mistakes. That's how they have made themselves into the wave of the future. And we're only beginning to learn how to fight this war in Iraq after 4 years. That's how Iran has gotten its power. If we can get our act together in Iraq, Iran doesn't have very much to offer that region except to help troublemakers make trouble.
Colonel Meese, your big picture view?
I think what that shows is that when we withdraw from Iraq and pull down the number of brigade combat teams that we have there, the movie doesn't end there. We can't click the channel and turn off and not be involved in the Middle East. That the actors that General Clark talked about, Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, are still going to have a role there. And in fact, the future of Iraq, regardless of how it sorts itself out, is going to be inextricably linked to the U.S. national security concerns in the region.
There's a lot more we can talk about in this topic. I'm afraid we're out of time. We're just going to have to leave it there for now. Thank you very much, Colonel Michael Meese, Political Science and Economics Professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and Les Gelb, Chairman Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York. Thanks for being with us on Great Decisions. And thank you as well for joining us on Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.